Good afternoon, Professor Bishop. We are happy to have you today in the frameworks of the project City as a Classroom.
Hello, Kalike.
The given interview with you is quite special for the reason that you are studying cities from the critical theory perspective.
Yes.
And by now you are the first person who is doing this type of research from critical theory viewpoint. So I would like to speak about that. So since the audience of the given project is very wide, I would like to ask you, could you please explain what is it like to study cities from critical theory perspective? What are the main constituents of such a study?
Well, I think there's many ways to study cities through critical theory as there are cities, and probably more, because the sorts of critical theoretical positions that I bring to bear on it come from very specific theorists, but also gets read through in another kind of way. We can, there's a book that I did with my colleague John Phillips and Yo Weiwei when I was at the National University of Singapore, and it's called Beyond Description, right? And in the introduction to that, we talk about the idea of studying and thinking about cities as being beyond mere description, that cities contain more than what can be properly captured by empirical description. You can do empirical description, of course, and you can capture all kinds of information with statistics and other sorts of things, but that's not really all that a city is, right? So we operated with, and this is maybe a useful way to be kind of get it and at an angle to your question, right? We can assume really that any system, any institution, any ensemble, anything that brings its elements together under a guiding principle or a guiding set of principles has come about on the basis of certain historical and systemic conditions. And as such, the ensemble would not fail to produce moments when its relationships to these conditions are thematized or dramatized or represented in some fashion. These moments produce what Lyotard would call a receit, sometimes linked to a grand receit, a story, what Barthes would call myths, or others might call fictions. It is stories and ideas that are formed about the city that are often narrated as facts, right? And that these can always be compared with the historical and systematic conditions themselves, which are readable through the ensemble at the level of its performance. So there's a way of looking at cities that capture its literal and its figurative elements, right? So that, and if you think about the Greek term topos, which means space, right? We also get in English, right? We get topic, we get topography, we get topology. We get all sorts of terms that operate around this that include both a material dimension of a site and the immaterial elements that combine with that materiality to create something that is specific to that place.
And my next question relates to our mutual area of research or interest, I'd say.
Yeah.
So I'd like to quote a small fragment from Baudrillard's book titled America.
Right.
I'll ask a question on that.
Okay.
So it goes as follows. The point is not to write the sociology or psychology of the car. The point is to drive. That way you learn more about the society than all academia could ever tell you.
Mm-hmm.
So Professor Bishop, how would you comment on this? Do you think it applies to any city in the world? The assumption itself that just by looking at the way people drive, we can understand a lot about their mentality and culture.
No, I think he's speaking very explicitly about cities and their development in the United States. I mean, it is a book, that book is about the US, and it's about his trips and adventures to the US in the 1980s, and how he saw in certain cities a reflection of the direct, well, it's kind of a glimpse into the future in terms of globalization processes, and the sorts of technologies and infrastructure that were being brought to bear in the United States that then became part of what the United States exported in terms of its ideological formulation in the struggle between, say, the former Soviet Union and the United States, as an attempt to become the dominant power in the world. So he's looking very specifically at the US because, I mean, the whole infrastructure system of highways in the United States tells a very specific story about the United States. I mean, if you look at, there's a really terrific book by a guy named Marshall Berman called All That Is Solid Melts into Air, which is, of course, a quote from Marx, right? And he looks at a few different cities as instantiations of the emergence of modernity as we understand it now. And one of them is St. Petersburg, and another one is New York. But he looks at New York under the influence of the urban designer Robert Moses, who ran major highways through New York City and completely altered its construction. So he looks at Paris and what Haussmann did to the streets and all of that. So that's one way to read cities conceptually, is looking at their infrastructure and seeing how the infrastructure dictates the ways in which people can act and interact with each other within a city. And for the US, the highway construction efforts post-World War II were an integral part of Cold War defense strategies, because it allowed a dispersal. So this goes with urban planning and the constitution of suburbs and smaller cities. So you had mobile nuclear families moving to smaller, decentralized, depopulated sites, which meant they weren't such an easy target for being hit by missiles, right? And also gave them the illusion of a kind of freedom of mobility through an auto industry and a petroleum industry that was literally driving major segments of the economy. So I think that's very specific to the United States, although we all know what traffic is like in Mexico City or Rome or Bangkok or any of the major cities where the car has become a weapon of assault.
So the next question is related more to criminalistics area, if you don't mind. To criminalistics, criminology, organized crime.
Criminology, okay.
One of research works of yours is titled Mumbai City as Target.
Yeah.
Could you think of reasons why different criminal groups conduct their activities more regularly in one cities and even reside in those cities? And why some cities are just like, I cannot say almost free from organized crime or any type of crime, but they're more safe, let's say, than others.
Well, just because organized crime is operating in a particular city doesn't mean it's unsafe. Back in the days, in the early days of Las Vegas, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, the mafia kind of ran that place, right? And then the mafia moved out and major corporations like Disney moved in. And people used to say, well, the mafia was kind of hard to deal with, but they took care of their employees and they always felt safe. They felt always protected, whereas they felt like Disney did not provide them that same sort of security. But in that particular instance with the Mumbai City as Target, that was primarily written, that section was generated in response to the terrorist attacks in Mumbai, right? Where they used cell phones and other things to mobilize and strike the hotel. And that particular piece grew out of an earlier piece that I did with a friend of mine, Greg Clancy, just called The City as Target or Perpetuation and Death, which was about the long-running herbicide in the 20th century that seemed to have disappeared from the popular imagination. If nothing else, the 20th century was an all-out assault on cities. Nothing could have anticipated aerial warfare and its devastating effects. And then we began to think about, well, what constitutes a global city? And a global city, we determined, one of the main things that determined a global city is that it was targeted for nuclear destruction. So there's a way in which the attractiveness of any city is also its danger. If in the past, if you were riding through the desert and you saw a huge walled city, you'd think, aha, there's something good in there. And as we know from reading Homer, from reading the Iliad, storming cities and raiding cities, sacking cities, that's what, you know, yuppies did to get ahead. That was a way to gain material wealth. That's what you did, right? And you wouldn't just go sack a little tent and that had a few goats outside of it. Nothing there was being protected. So it's always this kind of, and this is another kind of critical theory point, right? That the effort to defend yourself attracts the very thing that you wish to defend against.
And the fourth question, if we look at cities and people that reside in them and imagine a city as a set of factors that influence the personality development of people,
Mm-hmm.
then, and not only personality development, also that a city is a set of factors that would define the status of different people, the rank of them. So, in your opinion, what would be the factors in any city that influence actually the development of a personality in the most general sense?
Oh, I think that's a very hard question because you can generalize and you can make some kind of sweeping statements, but I think for the most part, the way in which a city affects its citizens is as diverse as there are citizens. Because it's in one way, when we talk about a city, it's a fiction. It's like any narrative, right? In any narrative, you can't include all the information. The whole purpose of a narrative is to, after the fact, give a kind of logic and trajectory to what was just chaotic events, right? And you impose a kind of structure, cause and effect, and that sort of thing. So the same thing is true of a city. The cause and effect relationship of the city on citizens depends very much on the citizens and their positions within it. How they, what their ethnicity is, what their class status is, what their access to infrastructure is. Because if you look at a city like, a huge city like Calcutta, the people experience it in very different ways because there are very, very wealthy people. There are people of the lower caste who are the untouchables, do certain sorts of work, don't have access to wealth, don't have access to any opportunities, don't have any infrastructure. They barely have enough food. So how do you say that that city shapes all of them in the same way? It could, you could say it shapes them in the same way insofar as it reinforces stratification and inequality.
If you have anything to add to city as a classroom notion or idea, please do so.
Okay, well, I think there are a couple of things to think about. One would be to think about the city as a classroom means that the city intends some sort of pedagogical goal. So then we have to think about, well, what might that pedagogical goal be, right? And so one of the ways to begin to think about that then would be to return to that relationship between the material and the immaterial dimensions of a given city. That is, the experienced city in terms of the built environment, but also its articulation to people in a particular way. Cities address people in the same way that all texts address people, right? And so you can think about the city as a text, you can think about the city as a palimpsest, but if you think about the built environment not only encloses space, it produces space. So what kinds of spaces are being produced there, and what kinds of activities is it trying to encourage, and what sorts of activities is it attempting to discourage and to potentially undermine? So that's one way to think about it, because it's telling you, the city tells you how to use it. You don't have to use it that way, but the city tells you how to use it. Similarly, if you think about the built environment, the ideological, historical dimensions of the city can also be found in the unbuilt environment. That is, anytime you build something, in the process, you have to unbuild what was there, right? Because what was there wasn't just a tabula rasa. It wasn't just a blank slate. Often it's another building. And so this building is superseding the previous building. If it's not a previous building, if it's nature, what kind of nature was there? And what is being destroyed in the process of building this building that is then sold to the citizens of the city as progress, as necessary development, as reflective of the growth and value and attitudes of that city. So I think part of thinking about the city as a classroom is thinking about the myriad ways in which we have to interpret what is there, what is present, and what is absent.